Okay, yeah, it was a long day yesterday. Bob Campbell, that'll be an interesting one if you can get here for him. When we first started doing whistleblows, steam whistleblows here in this area, again, Bob Campbell was one of the first people to come down to do recordings of that. And he does not only photographing, he does videos, and the sounds that he put in there were sounds that he recorded out at the Goodalls Park. Another thing for recording sound, I was just recently looking at the Boblo Boat Columbia's journey from Detroit going to New York City. It's going to be used on the Hudson River for cruises again. And the website that is following its restoration had a picture of the boat being towed out of Toledo once it had gone into the shipyard. And the sounds that you hear are from the Boblo Boat Columbia's whistle, and there's only one place that he could have gotten it, and he must have either gotten it from the park at Goodalls, or he got it from the event in St. Clair. Another great speaker is going to be when you have Fred Miller in, and he's going to talk about disasters. If I may, when he comes in, I'll bet you one of the disasters he's going to talk about is the Sidney Smith. Just a quick review, if I may, the Sidney Smith was upbound, just coming up to the bridge, and another ship was coming down. Has anybody ever watched the sailboats when they go up for the Port Huron to Mackinac race, or any time a sailboat goes up the river here? Have you ever noticed that they always go up on the Canadian side? It's because by the way the river bends there, the slack water is on the Canadian side. Ships love to go up the Canadian side because they're not fighting nearly as much current. However, when the Sidney Smith was coming up and the Parker Evans was heading downbound, the Sidney Smith got caught a little bit in that current, that downbound current, and it pulled him right in front of the Parker Evans. So basically the Parker Evans T-boned the Sidney Smith. And when that happened in the 70s, the river was closed here for some time. Steel mills in Pittsburgh and places like that were running out of steel. They're having to shut the plants down because they couldn't get steel past here, iron ore past here. And it's just lucky that somebody with the right connections was able to talk to the right person to make sure that this whistle came here, stayed here in Port Huron. And you can see this 11 months of the year except 2 weeks when we have it for whistle blows. It's always in the museum in the Marine Wing there. And another one that you'll find in the Marine Wing is the Kalkaska. This was built here in St. Clair County. Actually, it was built in St. Clair in 1884. And that was a wooden ship, and it was a bulk cargo. And again, we were lucky to get whistles like that. Another whistle we have is the Pilgrim, a passenger ship that wrecked just up the coast a little ways. Thank goodness those things were captured for our museum. Okay, but our purpose here today is fog signals. Okay, we're sitting in what was the fog signal room. Thank goodness we've got some pictures of what it looked like. So right in this corner is where the 2 expansion tanks would be put, and we'll talk about those in a little while. Anybody want to take a guess on when? We're just going to talk about fog signals in North America. Anybody want to take a guess at when the first fog signal was used in the United States or in North America? Before the Revolutionary War, 1719, in Boston, the first fog signal was used, and the first fog signal was a cannon. And those were being used routinely up until around, I'll tell you exactly when. In the early 1800s, that's when the first, or the most development for fog signals took place. 1837 is when they came up with the next. Basically, there were 5 different kinds of fog signals. The first one were the cannons. The second one were air-powered reed horns that were either powered by people or by horses. The next thing that we came up with were steam whistles, and then we had steam horns. Okay. In 1837, the next thing that we came up with was a bell. And the biggest one that they had was a 4,000-pound bell. I can't imagine how big a 4,000-pound bell is, but it must have carried an awful long ways. Something that I found interesting was that they did a study in around 1850, and the study was, how far could you hear a bell ringing if you changed how fast you rung it? And they figured out that they could hear a bell a mile and a half if you rang it 15 times in a minute, so every 4 seconds. You could hear it a mile if you rang it 30 times a second, so every 2 seconds you rang it. And if you rang it 60 times in a second, you could hear it 2.5 miles away. Now, I don't know where that study was done, but I thought that was interesting. So it must be that it was carrying that sound for so far, and it was staying resonant in the air. Have you ever noticed that you can hear a train whistle better on a misty day or on a humid day? Same thing with fog whistles. They carry for a long, long ways. But in the fog, they're very difficult to determine exactly where that sound is coming from, because there will be different temperature layers in the fog, as well as different areas where there's different temperature. And what that will do essentially is change where the sound seems like it's coming from that fog signal. Okay. 1850, Congress allocated the money to have 3 permanent fog signals set up here in the United States, and they were 2 in New York and 1 in Rhode Island. So essentially trying to get into the busiest harbor they had at the time, and that was New York Harbor. Short sidebar, the busiest harbor in 1899, San Francisco, because of the gold rush. If you go and look at the Library of Congress, you can see pictures of San Francisco Bay, and it looks like you can walk across the bay from one ship to another, because so many crews would get to San Francisco, and then they'd leave and they'd go to the gold fields, and the ships had no crews to sail them again, so they were stuck there. Okay. 1851, the next development in foghorns, and that was what's called a caloric engine. A caloric engine was either powered by 2 people turning cranks, or powered by a horse, either on a circle or on a treadmill, an elevated treadmill. And I've always wondered, I'm sure the horse would have gotten used to it, but I'm wondering what it was thinking the first time it started hearing that foghorn. I'd hate to be that guy. Okay, the way that those foghorns worked is that they would use a steel reed. Is anybody here, we have any clarinet players, any saxophone players? Okay. They're holding a reed, and they're holding it in their mouth, and they're adjusting the pressure on that reed. What they were using in the 1850s is they had a steel reed that went from about 2 inches down to a very small point, and they would use air to get that reed to vibrate. And as I said, they used what they called a caloric engine. And it was essentially just 2 pistons and a couple of guys just turning this thing that's going to generate pressure, probably reed valves, that it will allow air to pass one way but not to pass back again. And then they would have to store it in some kind of a vessel, some kind of a tank to build up pressure, or volume, I should say. An example would be, this room was where the engine was for running the foghorn, which was located just out on the the breakwater. There's a picture of it right there. And what they were using is what was the fifth kind of foghorn that was developed, but we'll talk about that just a second. This was the engine that powered the foghorn. Originally, it was a coal-fired boiler that was creating steam. Then they installed a diesel engine. This particular one that you see is driving a generator, and I see that right behind it, that next engine, that is an air compressor. But that air compressor is being driven by an electric motor. Right behind it, you'll see two white stacks, if you will. What those are the expansion tanks. The air pump, neither the air pump nor the boiler would be able to generate enough volume to sound horns that big, and they only sound for about a 3-second duration. But they need that 27 seconds to be able to, to be able to build up that pressure again. As an example, has anybody visited the lightship yet? Oh, please do. The lightship is one of the, consider it a floating lighthouse. The lightship was built in 1817. Neither its boiler nor its diesel engines, when it was driving an air compressor, could generate enough volume to sound that horn for 3 seconds. So you'll notice in the engine room, the only piece that's original from when the ship was built in 1917 and when it was repowered to diesels in 1948, the only original part are these two big tanks that are in the back corners of the engine room. That was to build up the volume to be able to sound the foghorn. So 27 seconds worth of a diesel engine running takes enough air to be able to blow that horn for just 3 seconds. Okay, now, the next thing that came along for development was 4 years later in 1855. That's when they started using steam whistles as a means of sounding fog signals. And what they were using in 1855 is they were using a 10-inch whistle, because that was the biggest whistle that they made in 1855. These are both 10-inch whistles. And the way that it works is that very bottom, I have steam coming into these whistles were designed to be on the smokestack, the front side of a smokestack of a freighter. I have steam coming into the bottom, and I have a valve lever. And the way this would work is that there was a chain, a bicycle chain that ran all the way from the back of the boat to the pilot house, and they're pulling on a lever to get this to sound. And they would have really powerful springs on here to get it to return up. So by pulling on the actuator in the pilot house, they're able to open the valve, and steam comes past, it passes into a bowl at the very base of the whistle, and then at the top of that bowl, there's what's called a languid plate, and there's only, oh, okay, 4 layers of paper won't go into that slot. It's a really small slot. And the steam that's coming in out of here is at whatever pressure the ship was running at. And the steam will come up to the bell, and then it will come back out, but there's still steam coming out. So basically they're crashing into each other, those two sources of steam, and that's what makes the sound in this whistle. And these are both 10 by 36 steam whistles, but the sound isn't the same just because this one's square. Oh, look at that. I never noticed that that one was square too. Most of the time there's a rounded cap on these. Often, because a 10 by 36 whistle was the most produced whistle in the Great Lakes, skippers would often move the bell of their whistles up or down just a little bit to change the tone of their whistles, just so that people know it was them when they were going by. Okay, so we're at 1855 when they created steam whistles. The next thing that we came up with after that was the steam horn. The reason that we came up with steam horns is that they were so much more efficient than a steam whistle. We just finished with the whistles on the water event, our 10th year in St. Clair, and one thing that people are impressed by the most is the columns of steam that these generate when they go off. It's, if you can imagine for a size, think about a silo, the size of a silo that's 100 feet tall. That's the volume, the column of steam that these whistles generate. Okay, the steam horn, the way that those work is that there is a thin metal plate that's vibrating by putting air on either side of it to get it to vibrate. And they put that plate at the backside of a trumpet, so a horn that's just expanding. And by virtue of that expansion, that's what's going to give you the volume for the sound. A good example of that is a lot of things happened in 1900. One of the things that happened in 1900 for fog signals is a Canadian company by the name of Leslie created the very horn that we're looking at in those pictures. It's, I don't think it would work to get that. It wouldn't work too well. Leslie built one of those trumpet horns that's now famous, and theirs was not a thin plate. If you visit the lightship, I believe we still have one of the reeds, what's referred to as a reed for that horn, the foghorn. It looks like a top hat. So if you can imagine, let's say a 1-pound coffee can, and then it has a base that's about 1 inch wide around it. That's what it looks like, a little top hat. That entire top hat is vibrating back and forth in the whistle. In 1911, that's when Leslie manufactured or came up with the whistle, and it was 6 years later when 2 of those foghorn whistles, those Leslie Super Typhons, were installed on the lightship when it was built up in Bay City. That was the foghorn that was being used for about 50 years. It was in the 1950s and the 1960s that electronics replaced all these apparatus, because a lot of this equipment was very high maintenance. When it was the bell that we were sounding in 1837, we had a clockwork. Originally, the lighthouse keeper was standing there hitting it with a hammer. Eventually, it wasn't long before they came up with the clockworks. So much like the clock that you see ringing in the church tower, well, we've got one that's just doing it on a much more regular basis. So the same way that we're revolving a light in the top of the lighthouse with weights, we'll have the same sort of thing going on with that clockworks to ring the bell. Now, the lightship. I'm a big fan of the lightship because I had the honor of rebuilding the diesel engines in there. And the lightship has something that's another invention. In 1900, a couple of guys in Lake Geneva, Switzerland, came up with the submerged bell, an underwater bell that you'd ring. And the way that this would be used is that the lightship, for instance, would send out a signal, a radio signal, that the ship that is listening to that, the freighter, he has a radio direction finding device that's able to find out in which direction that radio signal is coming from. But then they also have a hydrophone, a microphone underneath the ship that's listening in the water, and they're listening for the bell on the bottom side of the lightship that's rung at the same time that the radio beacon goes off. And they had a chart that they could see how many seconds it was from listening to the radio signal till the time that they heard the bell through the water. They could figure out how far away the radio signal was, because sound comes through water slower than the speed of light, and that's what radio signals are, is the speed of light. Much like when we were kids, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, we learned about thunderstorms where you see the flash and you count to 5, you know it's a mile off. Same sort of thing. The sound waves are passing at a different distance. Okay. Something else that was interesting to me is that in 1930, San Francisco Harbor had 51 different fog signals, and those were bells, there were whistles, they were fog horns, and what was the last one that we had? The sirens as well. A siren, they're high maintenance because they were very intricate. You would have a cylinder with holes in it spinning, and you'd blow air through it, and you'd put that next to a trumpet as well. And that's what would give you that wailing sound that you hear today on the fire engines and things like that. Okay, in 1939 is when the lighthouse service and the life-saving service combined to become the Coast Guard. But again, as I said, it was the 1950s and the 1960s when the fog signals themselves, all the various things that we were using were replaced by electronics. Something that I found interesting was things like odd navigational instruments, such as, I'd never heard of this one before, and that's sound boards or echo boards, that when a ship is getting close to an intersection with something, there would be a 90-degree angle wall built close to that obstruction, and the ship would be able to figure out how far away they were by how long the echo took to get back to them. Something else that I thought was interesting, and we have an example of this in St. Clair every year, is in the late 1800s, they developed what's the best way to call a buoy whistle. So it's a buoy that's anchored, but as it goes up and down with the waves, it traps air in the base of it, and as the wave goes up, the buoy is weighted down, and so the wave is passing by the buoy, and it's pushing the air that it trapped up through a whistle. We have one of those whistles in St. Clair. As a matter of fact, last year, just yesterday, we had 2 of them that were there, and the fellow that brought one in was sure, he brought it just for a static display. He was sure that we weren't going to be able to sound that whistle for him, but as it turns out, we had a flange that was able to fit right onto his whistle, and he wanted to know, how is it that you have a flange that will fit such an odd size pattern? And it was because we've already got one of those whistles. But they were whistles that were intended to be used at very low pressure, just the 2 or 3 pounds of pressure, it would sound the whistle. And the last one that I thought was interesting, it was in California, and they were using caves that had blowholes. So when the waves would come in, the blowhole would be sounding, and so they built a structure around it to capture that air, and they had a horn that was being sounded every time that the waves came in. But the problem was, it was a great idea, it worked wonderfully, but the problem is that when it's foggy, generally it's not stormy. So you're not going to have the waves to work, but when it's in a storm, it was great because people could hear exactly where it was that they were just based on the wave action. Okay. Yes, ma'am?
What did they use the buoy horn for?
Oh, those were placed all over on the coast, especially on the ocean coast of the United States, because that way they could mark channels coming in. Okay. You'd always, and it was a low tone, ooh, ooh. Okay. Often you'll hear recordings of nostalgia recordings from San Francisco. And the sound that you think that you're hearing is a foghorn. No, that's one of the buoy whistles that they have out there. And just by the design, they were perfect because you always knew where it was going to be. When I mentioned about the number of signals in San Francisco Bay, each one of those signals is charted. So when you look at the chart, you'll see what the characteristics are of that particular aid to navigation. Much like out here, when you look at a chart of the river, you're going to see where the buoy is, and you'll see a number on that buoy, and you'll also see what the characteristics are, how it flashes. Each of the light houses that you'll see, they each have different characteristics. How far apart the lights flash, that'll be marked on the chart so you know where you're at. Do we have any boaters, sailors? Okay, sometimes when you're out at night and you don't know exactly where you are, boy, you wish you did. And the way to do it is by paying attention and knowing the aids to navigation and working with them. Okay, any other questions?
When we were in Maine, several of those harbors there, they had a bell on their buoys, and each one of those buoys.
They had it on my list to mention that was the third development in the 1850s. And yes, the bells, so they've got it set so that as the buoy is rocking back and forth, that bell is going all the time, and they're having different tones, and I understand that some of them will have more than one clapper on them, so they'll be able to distinguish it that way. Back to the lightship. The lightship had 5 ways of signaling during the fog. They had the light that was on the mast, of course. They had a bell that was on the back mast up at the top, so as the ship is rocking back and forth, it's ringing as well. They also had the underwater bell that they would sound. They had the foghorn, of course, 2 of them on the boat, but they'd only use 1 at a time. And they had the radio signal. So, and as I mentioned before, with that underwater bell, it's being rung at the same time the transmitter's triggering the radio signal, so they'll be able to figure distance as well. Yes, sir?
Now, the permanent replacement buoy that's out in the lake now that took the place of the lightship, it doesn't have any foghorns on it, does it?
I should know that answer, and I don't.
Well, I've sailed here for a long time, and I don't ever remember it making a sound.
Okay. And is that it's a winter buoy that
That's permanent.
okay. All right. I didn't think it was.
It's a big permanent structure.
Sheboygan has a permanent buoy like that, and it does emit.
It does have
Yeah,
floats.
we used to live there, and you could hear it when it was really foggy. That would carry all the way into town, and it was at a certain point for the sailors, so they knew exactly where they were at.
Right. But it's so, as I mentioned, it's so hard to figure out where that sound is coming from, even with other ships as they're going down, trying to figure out where they are. Yeah.
Yeah, because even an 1/8 of a mile from the lake, you can hear the freighters real clear. You know, especially if there's a distress signal or somebody's in their way or whatever. You know, but when it's foggy, it can be kind of different.
You'll hear them coming. And I grew up here on the river as a wee shaver, and we know that 30 or 40 years ago there were a lot more ships. And when they were passing by on the river on a foggy night, you would hear them, keep you awake. Yes, sir.
Now, when did they do away with the foghorns here?
Here, that was in the 60s or the 70s that they did away with them. Yes.
Yeah, it says they did 1970.
1970s. And the thing is that we know exactly where all that equipment is. The diesels, the tanks, the compressors, the horns. Because when we go to as the county dump gets filled in, they map it, where it's at and the level. So if anybody really had enough interest, we could go down there and get those
I
things.
thought they sold all that.
Well, my information says that there was a lot of equipment trashed.
That's sad.
Well, much like in the engine room of the lightship, we've got equipment for those diesel engines that goes back to 1948. As one part was broken, it was put into the peak, and there's a lot of equipment back there that so I wouldn't be a bit surprised that went somewhere.
Yeah. For some reason, I thought I had read or was told by somebody in the Coast Guard that a lot of that stuff was sold.
I'd really like to find out more about that.
Yeah, I'll have to ask some more questions about that.
You had mentioned Maine. I find it interesting because many of the innovations were coming in the Maine coast. I haven't spent much time off the Maine coast, but I imagine it's pretty treacherous out there, Penobscot Bay. Other questions? Okay. I've got to put a plug in for things. Just whenever I see that the lightship is open today, go down and visit. Events that we have going on. Last Saturday of September, every year, we have the whistleblow whistles on the water in St. Clair, and we'll have I think the most we've had is 100 whistles brought in for the day, and they're brought in by collectors and museums. And it's the one place that you'll be able to listen to steam whistles with the ships going by and saluting back and forth to us.
We're at in St. Clair.
Right in Palmer Park, right downtown. And we talk to the ship captains and ask them if they'll give us a salute back. And normally we'll have a good number of ships going by, but this particular year, we only saw 4 go by, and they were all when we had the boiler taken down or before we started it up.
That's sad.
Is it just a common source for all this steam then, for all the different whistles, so you can bring those in and hook it up to a...
Yes, we have a trailer that has a package boiler mounted on it and a manifold that has 22 ports on it. So we'll put the whistles and we'll go one after another sounding them. And we've got some really classic whistles. This year's headliner was the Christopher Columbus, which was the only whaleback ship on the Great Lakes that was built as a passenger steamer. It was built in, I think the year was 1893 for the Columbian exhibition in Chicago. It was a day tripper for taking people for rides, but after the exposition closed, it became a passenger steamer. And that was our headliner this year. Our headliner last year was the Ashtabula, but most of the people that are bringing us stuff are private collectors. However, museums are bringing us things that they want to get a recording of that whistle. They have a whistle, but they've never heard it blow, so they'll bring it to us. We had a museum from Milwaukee there this year bring us a ship whistle. And we're getting better. We've now got a professional recorder. Last year and this year we've got them. Yes, ma'am.
It's saying that with the amount of pressure going through the whistle, make the sound change.
Yes. Either one of these, if you put a smaller valve on it, it would be a more mellow, more gentle tone. Myself, I want to put the biggest valve I can on the whistle so that I can find it to its greatest potential. And yes, as an example, for the first year this year at the Harvest Festival out at Goodall's, I was going to sound a steam horn at 7 o'clock when the kitchen opened so that everybody could come and get breakfast. But I only woke up an hour and a half before it was time, and I could only get 20 pounds out of the boiler. At 100 pounds, this whistle sounded great. It would have woken anybody up. But at 20 pounds, it was this nice, gentle, hey. So I've got to make it a point to get up earlier next year and use a bigger whistle. And what I've been doing lately is, with the whistle blows, is trying to find the most obnoxious sound that I can make. And in St. Clair, we were setting off car alarms on cars that were parked on the far side of the mall, which is 300 or 500 feet away. when we would sound 2 whistles that were the same size, but were just slightly off, so they would have that throbbing sound, and that sets a vibration right through the ground. And that's,
100 pounds, or
we're running these at 150 pounds this year. Our boiler is capable of 175, and it's a 250 horsepower boiler, but that's what it does justice to most of the whistles we can bring in. And
what did they usually set them off on ships? What did they usually use? 100 pounds?
it depended, early ships in the 40-pound era. I have one more whistle in the truck that I have to return to the museum. These belong to the Port Huron Museum, by the way. I have one more whistle that came from the Sterncliffe Hall, which was before the 1959 opening of the Seaway Terminal, or the Seaway Canal, St. Lawrence Seaway, I should say. The way to get cargo from the Great Lakes out to the ocean, it required a ship 250 feet or less. So canalers are what they were called. And there's a canaler whistle in there, the Sterncliffe Hall, and that is a low power boiler. That's about 40 pounds of what they ran on. Ships were running about 150 or 200 at the most, but when we get into the 1950s, we were still building steamships like the Ryerson. They went to much higher pressures. I really don't know what it is, but I know it's a higher pressure system. But it was locomotives and trains that were getting up into the 250 pounds and higher for their whistles.
So these would have more like a bullhorn sound.
It all depends on what the design is. And that's why I encourage you to come to St. Clair. We get such a variety of them, and we'll have, if you can imagine, a whistle like this that's twice as long as this bell. We have one like that, and the tone is so low. It's amazing to me. I don't know how many hertz it runs out at, but I don't know who would use it. It was a ship whistle, but again, I don't know what kind of ship it would have come from. Okay, other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Does the light ship still sound there?
We
You used to do it like right after Labor Day.
Well, we tried to get it 5 times. For a couple of years, we were doing Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, Tourist Your Own Town Day, and Veterans Day.
Okay.
But that's, I don't think we've run the generators or the air compressors in a long time. I know that I think the last time I started them, it was in 2006.
Yeah, that would be about the last time I remember hearing.
As a matter of fact, I was glad that the ship was open today. I saw it open, and I'm going to stop in and ask the site, whoever's on site, ask them if I can please go down and turn the main engines over.
Jerry's there, so.
Is he? Great, wonderful. Okay, Jerry will let me do that. And I just wanted to turn the engines over just to make sure that they'll still turn over. On the light ship, if I may, have I run over? Okay, on the light ship, there are 2 engines that are for propulsion. And one of the engines, the one on the starboard side, the exhaust pipe that ran up to the stack was taken off, so it was easier to see down into the engine room. Thank goodness they did that, because on the other engine, the can, just like a farmer in his tractor, you put a can over the top of the exhaust so the water doesn't in and crack things when water freezes. There were heavy metal cans on the top of the stack, and somehow they got knocked off of there, somebody playing up there, and so water was dripping into the port side engine, and we had to replace the rear 2 cylinders and pistons to get that engine to run again. But the starboard engine, which hadn't been run since the ship was taken off site in 1970, and this was in 2003 that we started with it, and the engine was locked up. But basically what was done is we took off the injectors, and every week that I came in for volunteer day, I squirted penetrating oil down in the cylinders. And after 6 weeks of that, a visitor came into the site, and he said, those engines right near the back where the flywheel is, generally they had a little plate there that you could take off. And what I did is I went back, look, sure enough, there's a little plate there. So I unbolted the plate, and there was the flywheel with all the gear teeth. And so what I did is I went and got a really big screwdriver, and I bashed it in there to see if it would turn. And I expected it to be solid, but it didn't seem solid to me. So I did it again the opposite direction, and I think it moved, but I wasn't sure. So I got somebody else that was working in the engine room. I said, come over here and do this. And he said, no, that moved. That wasn't solid. And so we just kept doing this back and forth, and by the end of the day, about an hour and a half's worth, we were able to get the engine to turn 90 degrees. We stopped there and started squirting more oil in the thing, and I think it was the very next week, we got it to turn all the way over, and what we did is we took the superchargers. That's a 2-cycle engine. We took the supercharger off, and I cleaned the blades on it, and in the process of cleaning the blades, the engine had to be turned over a number of times, and by the time that it was, the blades were finished, the old-timers, the engineer guys, there were 3 of them standing there, a little bit of an incredulous look on their face, and then one of them comes up and he turns the crank on the motor. And he looks at I saw this out of the corner of my eye, and he looks at the other guy, and the other guy walks up and he turns it. And so they confab a little bit, and then the third guy comes to me and says, okay, you can put it back together now. Meaning that that's a lot of work to put it back together, but basically once putting all these pieces back into the engine, the injectors and such, then it came time to try and start it. And so the old timer that said, okay, put it back together again, he is, with a wrench, we're bleeding out the diesel fuel, the fuel supply to the engine. And I'm hitting the starting button while he's doing this. And on the second cylinder, it started firing over. And then at cylinder number 4, I started thinking to myself, I don't know how to stop this engine. But basically, by the time we got through doing each one of them, it was running terrifically well, running great. And then I asked him, how do you turn it off? And then he shows me where the off button is. But I was a little worried there. I was starting something I didn't know that I could finish.
Well, they wouldn't run until it ran out of fuel.
Yeah, well, that's the problem, we had a can over to the side, but in the process of restoring the lightship, they discovered that there were 1,200 gallons of diesel fuel in the tanks in the ship.
And they had to take it off.
Well, see, actually, that diesel fuel, even though it was 38 years old, it was probably better diesel fuel that you can buy today. And we were really fortunate with the lightship because people were bringing us parts. And there was a company in Detroit called Superior Turbo and Diesel, and they were quite insistent, don't let anybody up here, work on those parts. You bring them down here and let us do it. And they essentially completely rebuilt the head on the port side engine, and that's thousands of dollars worth of work. And every time I went there, they were giving me more stuff. And when it came time for that engine to be started, we needed cylinders and pistons, and so the word went out. I don't know who did it, but eventually a box showed up, and Jerry gets 2 pistons and cylinders and rings, and they came from the Champion folks that run the ferry over to Harson's Island. They have engines just like that, and they had a stockpile of parts, and so the word got around. So people were wonderful in helping us get that going.
Well, that's a part of history that you like to keep going.
Exactly. If children have no idea where they came from, they'll have no idea where they're going. And that's why historical sites and the folks who have knowledge, it's important that we pass that on. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to say thank you so much. You folks have a great weekend, and I see it stopped raining, so let's get out and look at things.